Imagine the most powerful wall ever built by human hands. A wall so thick, so tall, so perfectly engineered that for over 1,000 years, every army that stood before it turned back in defeat. Generals who had conquered half the known world looked at those stones and chose retreat over humiliation. Entire empires crumbled, and yet those walls stood. Proud, immovable, eternal.
These walls did not merely survive history, they outlasted it.
Now imagine something changed. Not tactics, not numbers, not the courage of the men attacking. Something deeper, something that made the very idea of a fortress permanently, irreversibly obsolete. This is the story of how a black powder mixture and one extraordinary machine ended the age of invincible walls and launched the age of modern war. For centuries, civilization built upward. Every culture on Earth understood one fundamental truth: height meant survival. The higher your walls, the harder they were to breach. The thicker your stone, the longer you could hold. Cities were not just settlements, they were fortresses. And the greatest fortress in the medieval world stood at the edge of two continents, where Europe and Asia met across a narrow strait of water. Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, protected by the Theodosian Walls, a layered defensive system constructed in the 5th century that had never been successfully stormed by a direct assault. The outer wall stood 6 feet thick. Behind it rose an inner wall, nearly 15 feet thick and 40 feet high, fronted by towers that gave archers overlapping fields of fire in every direction. Between the two walls ran a broad terrace, and before the outer wall lay a deep moat, 60 feet wide. This was not just stone, this was the distilled military knowledge of 1,000 years, encoded in mortar and granite. Every army that had tried and failed had inadvertently contributed to the wall's perfection. Attacks were studied. Weaknesses were reinforced. The Theodosian walls were, in every practical sense, invincible. But there was a problem with building toward perfection. Perfection assumes the rules of the game will never change. In medieval warfare, sieges followed a predictable logic. You could starve a city into surrender. You could undermine its foundations, digging tunnels beneath walls and collapsing them. You could use rams to batter gates. You could fire projectiles using siege engines, catapults, and trebuchets capable of hurling enormous stones. These machines were impressive, terrifying even, but they had a ceiling. The largest trebuchet ever built could launch a projectile of perhaps 300 pounds. Against a 15-foot wall of packed limestone and mortar, that was inconvenience, not destruction. The logic of medieval war was fundamentally defensive. Walls won, attackers bled, sieges lasted years. This equilibrium had held for centuries, and it might have held forever, except that somewhere in the fields of China, centuries before these events, someone had discovered what happened when you combine charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter in precisely the right proportions. Gunpowder. The substance that would one day break the world's strongest walls. It arrived in Europe gradually, quietly, almost accidentally, carried along trade routes, borrowed through conflict, refined by experimentation. By the 14th century, European armies were using primitive cannons, small, unreliable, frequently as dangerous to the men firing them as to the enemy. But the principle was there. Chemical energy, converted to mechanical force, projected outward, not the kinetic energy of a swinging arm or a twisted rope, something far more violent, far more sudden. The problem was scale. Early cannons fired stones too small, too slowly, too inaccurately to threaten serious fortifications. To bring down a wall like Constantinople's, you would need something that had never existed. A cannon so large it seemed almost mythological, and in the mid-15th century, a young sultan decided he was going to build one. Mehmed II became ruler of the Ottoman Empire at 19 years old. He was obsessed with Constantinople, not simply as a military target, but as a symbol. The city was the last true heir of Rome. To take it would be to announce to the world that a new era had arrived, that a new empire now held the center of civilization. But Mehmed was not merely an ambitious idealist. He was a student of military engineering, a man who understood that winning required not just will, but the right tools. In 1452, a Hungarian cannon maker named Urban came to Mehmed with a proposition. He could build a cannon unlike anything that existed. A cannon capable of firing a stone ball so heavy, so fast, that no wall built by human hands could absorb the impact. Mehmed listened carefully. Then he gave Urban everything he asked for: raw materials, workers, money, and time. The result was cast in bronze at Adrianople over 3 months. When it was finished, it measured over 27 feet in length. Its barrel was 8 inches wide enough, reportedly, for a man to crawl inside. It fired stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. When it was test-fired, the sound was heard from miles away. Residents fled in panic, convinced the earth itself was splitting open. Here was something new. Not an improvement on what came before. A rupture. A categorical shift. The question was no longer whether a wall could be breached. The question was how long it would take. But transporting this weapon was itself a military operation. The cannon required a team of 60 oxen and 200 men to move. It could travel no more than a few miles per day. After every firing, it had to cool for hours before being reloaded, a process that itself required extreme care. Fire too soon, and the barrel could crack. Fire at the wrong trajectory, and the recoil could split the carriage. This was not a magical weapon. It was a machine of awesome power and profound limitations, and yet it was enough. On the 6th of April, 1453, Mehmed's army arrived before the walls of Constantinople. The defending force numbered perhaps 7,000 men, soldiers, sailors, and civilians alike pressed into service. Against them stood an Ottoman army of somewhere between 60 and 80,000. But numbers alone had never taken these walls. What was different this time stood in rows along the Ottoman line, dozens of cannons of varying sizes, anchored around the great bombard, Urban's Colossus, aimed directly at the Theodosian Wall. The bombardment began. The great cannon fired perhaps 7 times per day. 7. By modern standards, almost nothing. But each impact was unlike anything those walls had ever absorbed. The stone balls did not simply strike the surface. They transferred kinetic energy deep into the structure, fracturing the interior, loosening the mortar, destabilizing what centuries of compression had made solid. What a trebuchet could not do in a year, the cannon began accomplishing in days. The Byzantine defenders were not passive. Each night, they worked desperately to repair the damage, filling breaches with timber, rubble, and earth. For weeks, the rhythm was relentless. Bombardment during the day, frantic repair at night. The walls held, but the margins were shrinking. Inside the city, something else was breaking. Morale, supplies, hope. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI sent desperate appeals westward, to Venice, to Genoa, to the Pope, begging for relief forces that never came. Constantinople had survived Arab sieges, Bulgarian invasions, and even a brief Latin occupation. Surely the walls would hold again. Surely help would arrive. It didn't. After 53 days of sustained bombardment, the Theodosian Wall was failing in sections. The great cannon had cracked twice during the siege and been repaired and returned to service each time. Urban himself may have died when one of his guns exploded during operation, a reminder that this technology was as much a danger to its operators as to its targets. But the damage was done. Large portions of the outer wall had collapsed. The defensive depth that had made Constantinople impregnable was gone. On the 29th of May, 1453, Mehmed ordered the final assault. Ottoman forces poured through the breaches, over the rubble of what had been the most formidable defensive system the medieval world had ever constructed. Emperor Constantine died fighting in the streets. By morning, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the capital of Eastern Christianity, as the repository of Roman law and Greek knowledge and Byzantine culture, had fallen. The world registered it like a shockwave. Scholars fled west carrying manuscripts that would help ignite the Renaissance. Trade routes reorganized as Christian merchants lost access to Eastern markets, accelerating European exploration of alternative paths to Asia. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the crossroads of the known world. A new order had begun. But the most consequential legacy was not geographic or political. It was architectural, it was strategic. Every ruler in Europe looked at what had happened to Constantinople and understood that their own walls were now vulnerable in a way they had never been before. The engineering assumptions that had governed fortress construction for centuries were wrong. Stone height was no longer sufficient. Stone thickness was no longer sufficient. The equilibrium that had kept cities safe and attackers frustrated was broken, possibly forever. Fortification science had to reinvent itself entirely. The star fort emerged as the answer. Low, angled walls of earth, and masonry designed not to resist cannon fire but to absorb and deflect it. Military budgets shifted. Artillery arms races began. Siege warfare became a technical discipline as much as a martial one. Armies that mastered gunpowder controlled territory. Armies that did not were left behind. And the cannon itself evolved rapidly. Within a generation of Constantinople's fall, guns were lighter, faster, more accurate, and more mobile. The weapon Urban built was almost immediately obsolete, a prototype for a transformation rather than its final form. But that is often how history works. The first version of something world-changing is usually clumsy, oversized, dangerous to operate, and desperately impractical. What matters is the proof of concept. What matters is the demonstration that the impossible is possible. Humanity had spent 1,000 years building higher and thicker. It had assumed that the answer to military threat was always more stone, more height, more permanence. Gunpowder rendered that entire tradition obsolete in the span of a single human lifetime. The fall of Constantinople was not simply the fall of a city. It was the moment the old rules died. Every fortress that came after was built in the shadow of what had happened here, designed not for a world where walls were inviolable, but for a world where nothing was. From that morning in May 1453 forward, warfare entered a new age. An age defined not by who could build the strongest wall, but by who could build the most powerful machine to tear it down. The age of stone was over. The age of fire had begun. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you like it.